2,600 times. That is the approximate number of times the word Israel appears in the scriptures. No other nation receives such attention. No other people carries so many promises, warnings, and prophecies concentrated in a single name. And here is what many ignore. A good part of these prophecies has not yet been fulfilled. Or has it already been fulfilled, and we did not notice? Scholars have disagreed for centuries. But one thing is undeniable. The texts exist. They were written millennia ago, and today you will know exactly what they say. Think of the scenario. A people that did not exist as a nation for 1,878 years, dispersed across all continents, massacred during the Second War, 6 million dead in less than 6 years. And after all that, in 1948, this people reconstitutes a sovereign state in the exact region that the ancient texts described. Historical coincidence or prophetic fulfillment? Let us go to the texts. The prophet Ezekiel wrote around 590 years before Christ in the Babylonian exile. The scenario was one of total desolation. The people had lost their land, their temple, their national identity, and it was in this context that Ezekiel recorded the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. Ezekiel chapter 37 describes a valley covered with human bones completely dried out. Under divine command, the bones begin to come together. Tendons appear. Flesh covers the skeletons. Skin clothes the bodies. And finally, the breath of life enters them. The text itself explains, "These bones are the whole house of Israel." Consider this. When Ezekiel wrote, Israel would cease to exist for more than 2 millennia. The Second Temple would be destroyed by the Romans in 70 after Christ. The Jews would be scattered throughout the entire world. Empires would be born and fall. And during all this time, the Jewish people remained without land, without their own government. Dry bones. 1,878 years after the Roman exile, on the 14th of May of 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. In less than 24 hours, 5 Arab armies invaded the territory. A country with 650,000 inhabitants faced forces of nations with more than 40 million people combined. Israel survived. It expanded its territory. Today the population exceeds 9.5 million. Hebrew, a dead language for centuries, became a living language again. Bones that stood up? Skeptical scholars argue that the fulfillment is symbolic, or referred to the return from the Babylonian exile. Literal scholars point out that the scale of the modern return is incomparably larger, more than 7 million Jews today in Israel, against about 3 million before the Roman destruction. The numbers speak. The interpretation remains with you. But Ezekiel did not stop there. Chapters 38 and 39 describe something even more disturbing, a future war involving a coalition of nations against Israel. The text names the leader, Gog, of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. The coalition includes Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, and Togarmah. An army like a cloud that covers the land, coming from the uttermost north. Who is Gog? Where is Magog? Some identify Magog with regions today corresponding to Russia and Central Asia. Meshech and Tubal would be areas of modern Turkey. Persia is current Iran. If you accept this interpretation, the map is disturbing, an alliance between Russia, Iran, Turkey, and African nations against Israel. Others reject this reading. They argue that Ezekiel used terms of his time for generic threats from the north. Mapping ancient prophecies onto modern nations would be speculation without basis. And here is something that many people who seek to deepen their biblical understanding end up discovering too late. The surface of these prophecies hides layers of meaning that require deeper study. You may know the history of Israel. You may have heard about Ezekiel, but how many times have you stopped to examine every word, every name, every geographical detail that the prophets left recorded? The faith that remains in times of uncertainty is that which is grounded in real knowledge of the Scriptures. And when the subject is God's plan for Israel and the nations, every detail matters. Every word carries weight. It is exactly for this reason that we prepared the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, because everything the prophets announced about Israel finds its central point at the cross. and understanding what Christ said in his last hours reveals dimensions that completely transform the prophetic reading. To access it now, it is simple. You are seeing a square code on the screen, the QR code. Take your cell phone, open the camera application, and point it at this code. A secure link will appear automatically. Tap on it, and you will have immediate access to the digital book. If you prefer, the link is also in the description of this video. On the cell phone, tap on the title of the video or on the More option to see the full description. On the computer or television, look just below the video. Thousands of people are already deepening their faith through this reading, and when you access the book, you are also helping to keep this channel active, allowing us to continue bringing biblical content like this. Access now and comment Amen down below. Returning to the prophetic texts. Daniel is another essential prophet. He served in the court of Nebuchadnezzar and recorded chronologically specific prophecies. Chapter 9 presents the 70 weeks, 490 years, divided into periods that mark the order to restore Jerusalem, the coming of the Messiah, and the destruction of the city. Observe the precision. The decree of Artaxerxes in 445 before Christ until 69 weeks of years reaches the period of the ministry of Jesus. The prophecy also predicts that after the death of the Messiah, the people of a prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, fulfilled in 70 after Christ when Rome razed Jerusalem. But the 70th week generates controversy. Daniel describes in it a covenant established, sacrifices interrupted, and the abomination of desolation. Preterists argue that it was fulfilled in the 1st century. Futurists see an interval of 2,000 years, the last week still to come, connected to the apocalypse. This divergence determines how you read everything. If the week has already passed, prophecies about Israel would be fulfilled. The modern return would be historical, not prophetic. Promises transferred to the church. If it is still to come, Israel remains central in the divine plan. Do you perceive how the same Bible sustains opposite interpretations? Zechariah adds more layers. Writing in the 5th century before Christ, he describes Jerusalem as a cup of staggering and a heavy stone for all nations. Chapter 14 presents all nations in battle against Jerusalem. The city is taken. Half goes into exile, and then the feet of God touch the Mount of Olives. The mount divides. A valley opens. How to interpret? Some read literally, a world war followed by visible divine intervention. Others see apocalyptic language describing spiritual victory over the forces of evil. The text exists, the interpretations diverge, and it is exactly at this point that you need to decide how you will read these texts. There is no neutrality here. Your interpretation shapes how you understand the current world, the relations between nations, and the future of humanity. The question of Israel and the nations is not just an abstract theological debate. It touches concrete geopolitical reality. The United States has historically been the main ally of Israel since 1948. 11 minutes after the Declaration of Independence, Harry Truman recognized the new state, against the recommendation of his own State Department. Since then, the alliance has gone through moments of greater and lesser intensity, but it was never completely broken. Billions of dollars in military aid, diplomatic support in UN votes, cooperation in intelligence and technology. This partnership has shaped the Middle East for more than 7 decades. But alliances change, and here is what many prefer to ignore. The Bible does not mention any nation that clearly corresponds to the United States in the prophecies about the last days. This generates uncomfortable questions. If Israel remains central in the final events, where is its main ally? Why does such a powerful nation not appear in the prophetic texts? Some suggested answers. Perhaps the United States does not exist as a relevant power in the period described. Perhaps they are included in broader categories such as nations or isles. Perhaps the prophecies do not intend to map every specific nation. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that generates more controversy, the American absence suggests abandonment of the alliance. I am not affirming that this will happen. I am showing how different interpreters read the same prophetic silences. Defenders of Israel frequently cite Genesis 12, verse 3. God says to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless thee, and curse those who curse thee." This promise is interpreted as a permanent principle applicable to the nations that treat the descendants of Abraham well or poorly. History offers examples that seem to confirm this pattern, and others that complicate the interpretation. Empires that persecuted Jews eventually fell, but empires that had no particular relation with the Jewish people also fell. Correlation does not establish causality in a conclusive way. Again, the facts are available. The interpretation depends on presuppositions that you bring to the text. And while you process this information, it is worth remembering that every prophecy about Israel points to something greater. The prophets did not write only about politics and wars. They wrote about redemption, about a plan that spans millennia. And the center of this plan is not a nation or a territory, it is a person. Everything converges to Christ. That is why the last words of Jesus carry such extraordinary weight. In those final hours, while he hung on the cross in Jerusalem, the city that Zechariah described as a heavy stone for the nations, Christ pronounced 7 declarations that reveal the deepest meaning of everything the prophets announced. The digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, explores each of these declarations with the depth they deserve. To access it now, use the QR code on the screen. Take your cell phone, open the camera, point it at the code, and tap on the link that appears. Or access through the description of the video. On the cell phone, tap on the title to expand. On the computer, look just below the player. Your access helps to keep this channel producing biblical content. Access now. Continuing with the analysis of the nations mentioned in the prophecies, the Apocalypse of John adds elements that further intensify the debate. Chapter 16 describes the 6th angel pouring out his bowl upon the river Euphrates. The waters dry up to prepare the way for the kings who come from the east. Unclean spirits gather the kings of the whole world for the battle of the great day of God the Almighty. The place of the gathering is identified by the Hebrew name Armageddon. Ha-Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo. Megiddo is a real location in Israel, a valley that has witnessed decisive battles throughout millennia, from Egyptian pharaohs to British generals in the First World War. Napoleon supposedly called the place the most natural battlefield in the world. The geography exists. The question is whether the prophecy describes a literal future event or uses symbolic language to represent the final conflict between good and evil, independent of a specific physical location. Historicists interpret the apocalypse as a panorama of the history of the Church, with symbols representing the papacy, the Reformation, European empires, and events that unfolded over centuries. For them, Armageddon may have already occurred in some sense, or represents ideological confrontations between Christianity and secular powers. Preterists situate most of the apocalypse in the 1st century. The visions would describe the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of Rome, and the establishment of the kingdom of Christ in the resurrection. Armageddon would be a spiritual battle already fought and won. Futurists read most of the book as a description of events yet to come. Literal tribulation, literal Antichrist, literal battle involving real armies converging upon Israel. Idealists interpret the entire book as a timeless description of the conflict between God and Satan, without correspondence to specific historical events. Armageddon represents any moment in which forces of evil seem to triumph before divine intervention. 4 schools, the same text, completely different conclusions. And what does this mean for the nations today? If you accept a futurist reading, current alliances and conflicts in the Middle East gain a prophetic dimension. Every rapprochement between Russia and Iran, every tension involving Turkey, every change in American policy regarding Israel, everything can be read as a piece of a puzzle revealed millennia ago. If you prefer other interpretations, these events are significant for historical and political reasons, but not necessarily a fulfillment of ancient texts. Intellectual honesty requires recognizing that both positions have serious and scholarly defenders. What cannot be denied is the centrality of Israel in these texts. Even interpreters who spiritualize the prophecies recognize that the biblical writers had Israel, the people and the land in mind when they wrote. The question is whether this centrality remains valid or was replaced by a new people of God defined in spiritual terms. Paul addresses this tension in Romans chapters 9 to 11. He asks, "Has God rejected his people?" And he answers emphatically, "By no means." He describes Israel as an olive tree whose branches were partially cut off so that Gentiles could be grafted in, but the original branches can be grafted in again. All Israel shall be saved, Paul writes in chapter 11, verse 26. What does all Israel mean? The ethnic people? The totality of the elect, including Jews and Gentiles? A faithful remnant? Interpretations vary, but the text remains, and its implications for how we understand God's plan continue to generate intense debates. Think of the magnitude of what is at stake. If the prophecies about Israel are literal and still future, then we are witnessing preparation for cosmic events. The return of a people to their land after almost 2 millennia would not be a historical coincidence, but a fulfillment of divine promises. And the nations that position themselves on this board would be choosing their prophetic destiny. If the prophecies are symbolic or already fulfilled, the meaning changes completely. Israel would be an important nation like any other, but no longer central in the divine plan in a unique way. The church would have inherited the promises, and current events would be read by common political logic, not prophetic. You cannot embrace both visions simultaneously. They are mutually exclusive. And here is the challenge that many believers face. Which interpretation honors the biblical text more faithfully? Defenders of each school point to favorable verses. They criticize the other schools. They produce books, conferences, debates, and the consensus remains distant. Perhaps this is intentional. Perhaps the ambiguity preserves necessary humility. No one can claim to know the future with absolute certainty based on prophetic interpretation. The texts reveal enough to generate hope and vigilance, not enough to produce arrogance. What we know with clarity is this: God has a plan. This plan includes Israel in some significant way. The nations are involved in this plan, and the outcome does not depend on politicians or generals. It depends on Him who is seated upon the circle of the earth, as Isaiah wrote in chapter 40. And this God is not a distant spectator. He inserted Himself into history. He was born in Bethlehem. He walked through Jerusalem. He died on a cross outside the walls of the city that prophets described as the center of the world. And His last words on that cross carry meaning that illuminates all previous prophecies. Every word of Christ is a key that opens prophetic doors. That is why the digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, is essential reading for those who want to understand the complete plan. It is not just about devotion. It is about understanding, about seeing how everything connects. Use the QR code on the screen now, point the cell phone camera and tap on the link, or find the access in the description of the video. When you access, you also strengthen this work of biblical teaching. Comment Amen if you are being edified. Returning to historical analysis. The pattern of nations in relation to Israel throughout history offers material for reflection. Babylon destroyed the first temple. Where is Babylon today? Rome destroyed the second temple. Where is the Roman Empire? The Third Reich tried to eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. It lasted 12 years. Israel remains. Does this prove that God protects Israel? Critics argue that many nations fell without relation to the treatment given to the Jews. The Mongol Empire, for example, African empires, Chinese dynasties. The question is whether a specific pattern exists, or if we are seeing connections that do not objectively exist. Defenders of the prophetic vision point out that no other ancient nation survived in a comparable way. Modern Egyptians do not speak ancient Egyptian. Modern Greeks do not practice Olympic religion. Iraqis are not Babylonians. But Jews continue practicing traditions more than 3,000 years old. They continue reading texts in Hebrew. They continue celebrating feasts instituted in the time of Moses. This cultural persistence is notable. Whether it constitutes evidence of special divine protection is a matter of faith, not empirical demonstration. But the facts remain, and when we look at the current scenario, the complexity increases. Israel faces pressure from multiple directions: diplomatic, military, economic. The United States remains an ally, but the nature of this alliance is debated. Different administrations adopted distinct policies. What would happen if the alliance ended? This question is answered in very different ways depending on presuppositions. Secularist geopolitical analysts would evaluate in terms of balance of power, strategic interests, Israeli military capacity for self-defense. Israel possesses an advanced economy, cutting-edge technology, well-trained armed forces, presumed nuclear capacity, although never officially confirmed. Could it survive without American support? Probably yes, some argue. With difficulties, but yes. Futurist prophetic interpreters read the possibility through a different lens. An American abandonment could be a precursor to the events described in Ezekiel 38, when Israel is dwelling in safety before the attack of the Northern Coalition. Perhaps this safety is confidence in itself after perceiving that traditional allies are not reliable. Or perhaps the safety is a false peace, guaranteed by an agreement with a power that later turns against Israel, which some connect with the covenant mentioned in Daniel 9. Speculations upon speculations, and this is the nature of this type of analysis. The texts are fixed, the applications are infinite. What can you do in the face of this complexity? Firstly, know the original texts. Do not depend on second-hand interpretations. Read Ezekiel, read Daniel, read Zechariah, read Apocalypse. With an open Bible, not with social media summaries. Secondly, recognize that humility is appropriate. Previous generations were certain about interpretations that subsequent events did not confirm. Dates marked for the return of Christ that did not happen. Identification of antichrists who died without fulfilling the prophecies. Prophetic maps that needed to be redrawn repeatedly. Thirdly, keep focus on what is clear. Christ will return, evil will be defeated, God will reign. These are consensuses among practically all schools of interpretation. The details, when, how, in what sequence, remain debated. But the final destination is not in doubt, and perhaps that is what matters most. While scholars debate Gog and Magog, while analysts speculate about geopolitical alliances, while modern prophets make predictions, the permanent invitation is simpler and deeper, to know him who is at the center of all prophecies. Every vision of Ezekiel, every dream of Daniel, every oracle of Zechariah, every symbol of the Apocalypse, everything points to Christ. He is the interpretive key. Without him, the texts become a puzzle without a solution. With him, even the most obscure passages gain light. It is exactly for this reason that the last words of Jesus deserve such careful study. In those 7 final declarations, the entire biblical history finds its meaning. The sufferings of Israel, the promises to the patriarchs, the visions of the prophets. Everything converges at that moment in Jerusalem, almost 2,000 years ago. The digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, offers exactly this in-depth study. Scan the QR code on the screen now with your cell phone camera and tap on the link. Or open the description of the video. On the cell phone, tap on the title or on More. On the computer, look below the player. Every access strengthens this ministry of biblical teaching. So what to do with all this? You have just traversed texts written more than 2,500 years ago, prophecies that mention nations, armies, alliances, and betrayals. Some were fulfilled in a documented way, others remain open to interpretation, and others still await him, according to many scholars, a future fulfillment that no one can date with precision. What is undeniable is this: Israel exists. Against all historical probability, the people who were dispersed for almost 2 millennia returned to the land that the prophets described. This is not a religious opinion. It is a geographical and political fact that any map confirms. The question that remains, and that each person needs to answer for themselves, is whether the next chapters of this story are already written or are still being decided. Regardless of your conclusion, one thing the biblical texts make clear: God is not indifferent to what happens to Israel. And if he is not indifferent, perhaps you should not be either. And now that you have come this far, you understand that this knowledge cannot stay only on the surface. You saw how ancient prophecies connect with modern events. You saw how scholars diverge, but how the texts remain firm. And you saw how everything, absolutely everything, points to Christ. The last words of Jesus were not accidental. Each one carries prophetic weight. Each one reveals layers of meaning that most have never examined. The digital book, The 7 Last Words of Jesus That Shook Jerusalem, was prepared exactly for this, to open your eyes to what Christ communicated in those final hours in Jerusalem, the city of prophecies. Scan now the QR code that is on your screen. Take your cell phone, open the camera, point it at the square code and tap on the link that appears. It is immediate access. If you are on another device, open the description of this video. On the cell phone, tap on the title or on the More option to expand. On the computer or television, look just below where the link appears. When you access this material, you are doing more than studying. You are helping to keep this channel active, allowing us to continue producing deep biblical content like this, which you have just watched. Access now, and comment Amen down here to declare that your faith is being strengthened through the knowledge of the Scriptures.